Hello there, and good afternoon. We're going to wrap up this topic on development by talking about adolescence and adulthood a little bit. Okay, so adolescence is that period where you're not a child, you're not an adult. I wonder where this thing called preteen fits nowadays. Preteen is something that was invented by the Disney Channel or something, right, to get a niche market for their programs, but whatever. So adolescence extends from puberty to independence. When is independence? You already heard my opinion when a kid finally pays their cell phone bill, right? Who knows, right? Well, puberty is a period of sexual maturation. We find that this notion of adolescence, at least for women, in 1890 was 7.2 years, and at 1995, about 100 years later, it was 12 and a half years. And I'd be willing to bet it's even further now, as I bet you the average age of marriage is much closer to 30, and the average age of menarche or first period is probably earlier than that 12 and a half listed there in 1995. So by these measures, it's an interesting that it's earlier. So the changes that happen, at least physical changes during adolescence, are all triggered by the endocrine system, right? The hormones coming from the endocrine system, and so the body during adolescence, during puberty, right? The body goes through the changes required to that would be required for producing offspring. Okay, and so the ovaries begin to fertilize. The rephrase that the eggs in the female ovaries begin to mature and begin to process. The testes in the male begin to produce viable sperm. But there's also a lot of secondary sexual characteristics which are associated with puberty, but are not actually anything to do with the actual act of reproduction, right? Secondary sexual characteristics. Children's growth, you see this is a fairly steady line. It tends to somewhat level off on around 18. But what we see here is that at least for a time there, around 12 to 13, girls on average are taller than boys, but later on, And when it comes to maturation, it's kind of a strange thing. Early maturing boys are very popular. Early maturing girls are popular too, but for the wrong reasons, okay? And so what we find is in particular, early maturing girls get treated as though they are much older and are people act to them in ways. And so sometimes very early maturing girls can be 11 years old, but being treated as though they are far, far older. And it's early maturity is good for a boy, not good for a girl. Physical changes. Yeah, we said all that. It's a nice picture, though. All right. Up in an adulthood, what kind of changes are going on? Well, menopause, actually, and menopause being that time where the natural cessation of menstruation. Men don't seem to have anything like a menopause, or rephrase that. I mean, if men do go through changes at this point, they're more gradual rather than, or well, even menopause is somewhat gradual, but there's no visible cut point. Alzheimer's disease, which is clearly different from more normal dementia, and Alzheimer's disease is characterized by a gradual deterioration of memory, reasoning, language. Alzheimer's disease is actually caused by neurofibrillary tangles. So what essentially happens is that the inside of each neuron there is a protein, a tau protein, and this tau protein, what it does is it holds the microtubules, let's say the vessels inside the neuron, the vessels that transport information, transport materials, raw materials for neurotransmitters back and forth and stuff. And so tau holds them in place, and so when the tau deteriorates, all of these microtubules inside the neuron tangle up, and you get what they call neurofibrillary tangles. And when the microtubules get all connected to each other, tangled up, the neuron can't feed itself, right? And it literally dies of starvation. So some of the physical changes in adulthood, we see that granted between like 30 and 68 or something, there's a slow gradual change in these outcomes, but then somewhere around 70, it's a pretty big plunge. So here we got proportion normal vision, percent correct when identifying smells, percent correct when identified spoken words. So pretty big plunge there. Here, check it out, we've got accidents. And so what we have on the bottom, where is it? Accidents per 10,000 drivers, and there's an increase with age. But fatal accidents per 100 million miles spikes. And this particularly spikes because, old people tend not to make long car trips, right? They tend to go back and forth to the grocery store. And so all of a sudden, if you're talking about accidents per mile, it's really a big difference. Dementia, yeah, the risk of dementia does in fact spike with age. And again, this dementia is different from Alzheimer's disease. So dementia is like a gradual decrease in cognitive processing rather than the neurofibrillary tangle type problem with Alzheimer's. Here, cognitive changes like being able to remember names. I mean, it's hard to remember names, but if you've been introduced 3 times, come on, right? And so we can see, though, that, after either 1, 2, or 3 introductions, the older you are, the harder it is to remember it. Here, however, is an interesting graph. This is the number of words recalled. And so if you did like a memory test and you ask people, recall the words that you just saw, number of words recalled goes down with age, but the number of words recognized is stable with age. So recall memory goes down, recognition memory seems to be stable. Interesting. When studying intelligence, for example, one of the most important things, question is, put it gently, are old people dumb, right? I bite my tongue, but you get the idea. This is the questions being asked, and if you look at that orange line right there, yeah, the orange line is a cross-sectional study, and according to a cross-sectional study, at least using reasoning ability score, that look at it, it's a plunge with age, but cross-sectional studies are studies that are done where, say for example, what age ranges do they have there? 25, 32, 81, okay. So what they're going to do is, they'll find some 32-year-olds, some 39-year-olds, some 45-year-olds, etc. And they're going to test their cognitive reasoning ability score. And look at that. But you see, the problem is people that are 80 or 74 or something today are far less likely to have had formalized education, right, to have these opportunities. So if you do a longitudinal study, which is that blue line, where you measure the same people over time, and this is hard to do. Lewis Terman did a very good one. We already had, I think we just badmouthed Terman a little while ago, but Lewis Terman did a fascinating study where in fact, pretty much the greatest cross-sectional study or longitudinal study ever. He measured the intelligence scores of people for 60 years. I mean, the study went well past Lewis Terman's lifetime, and they just followed up and followed up and followed up, and it was relatively stable across the lifetime. So when we look at intelligence, we can talk about fluid versus crystallized intelligence. And we find that fluid intelligence, your ability to reason quickly or something like that, does seem to decrease with age, especially in later adulthood. But crystallized intelligence, more like wisdom, accumulated knowledge and skills and things of this nature, tends to actually increase. So in most situations, what happens is older people can function just as well as younger people, and it's a trade-off. As their fluid intelligence is decreasing, their crystallized intelligence is increasing, and therefore the net output will be relatively similar. The social clock, what your culture expects you to do. That you've passed the social clock if somebody starts asking you, so when are you going to get married? Your aunt says it or something. Yeah, because you violated the social clock. Verbal intelligence scores stayed stable, and nonverbal scores declined. Okay, good. Here's a very similar thing. Those lines that are going downward, sloping downward, is a processing capacity. Those sloping upward is world knowledge. So again, that's a visual representation of the crystallized and fluid intelligence. How about social changes? Is there a midlife crisis? And so it doesn't look like it. If you look at emotional instability, I mean, people are emotionally unstable at all the ages. There doesn't seem to be any spike in any one of these ages. So this midlife crisis thing doesn't seem to hold out. Or here, how about this? Life satisfaction scores. And across, despite the fact that the sensory organs are decreasing and everything else, you see that the percent of people that report satisfied with their life as a whole remains relatively steady across ages. We find one of the major changes in later adulthood is death of a spouse. And so you can see what happens here. We've got life satisfaction score 4 years before the spouse's death, and then leading up to the year of the spouse's death, we see life satisfaction scores decreasing, presumably because of the spouse's ongoing illness or something of this nature. And then all of a sudden what happens is that if you go to, say, 4 years post-spousal death, you're just about back where you were in the first place. So it definitely has an impact, but it is an impact that does, in fact, wear off. And so, as we know from Erik Erikson's social stage theory, there's these two primary commitments in later adulthood: the intimacy versus isolation, where we commit ourselves to these relationships, and generativity versus stagnation. And we've talked about that, but a sense of giving back and having purpose, which of course leads to the last stage, right, which was integrity versus despair. So the development doesn't just happen during, the childhood years and the adolescence, but it continues throughout life. All right, so that's what I've got to say on development. So I will see you again someday.